Even whilst the Second World War was still going on, there were a number of war crimes trials which took place to condemn captured prisoners of war who had been involved in slaughter on an unprecedented scale. Those liberated lands put some of their enemies ruthlessly to the sword to show the people who had survived much terror that justice was being carried out. For example, in the city of Leningrad, there were a number of German officials and members of the armed forces, including some high-ranking generals, who were led up to a huge gallows for their execution. Each one of these men was said to have been staunch enemies of the Soviets, and for this and their actions, they were executed on a large gallows beside each other. The huge crowds that gathered that day had lived through possibly the most intense siege in recent history, and for them seeing the German officers swinging was some form of retribution and vengeance for their own suffering. But inside of another Soviet city, during 1943, there was a series of executions carried out to bring a number of German officers and soldiers to justice for their horrific war crimes. But what happened with this brutal public execution? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 22nd of June 1941, the Wehrmacht and German armed forces rampaged into the lands of the Soviet Union with the launching of Operation Barbarossa. This became the largest military offensive in human history, and around 10 million soldiers took part, and there were roughly 8 million casualties during the operation. It led to some of the most deadly battles in history, such as Stalingrad, and led to sieges such as what occurred at Leningrad. Barbarossa opened up the Eastern Front, and saw Hitler's forces fighting on two fronts, and when launched, 3.8 million soldiers belonging to the Axis alliance invaded the Western Soviet Union along an 1,800-mile front. There were over 600,000 vehicles used, 600,000 horses, and many tanks and other weapons. As the German army seized different lands and began to occupy towns, the Einsatzgruppe Nazi death squads rampaged into these regions, and they gathered up thousands of civilians for extermination, often getting these men, women and children to dig their own graves. The lands of the Soviet Union were put to the sword, and there were also mass gassings conducted against civilians, and over 1 million Soviet people were slaughtered in this part of the Holocaust. Hitler wanted to destroy communism and Bolshevism, and he ordered his men to execute any political commissars, and the Germans did catch the Soviets by surprise with the attack. Stalin himself believed that Hitler would never invade his lands, as the two nations had signed a peace agreement in the form of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact previously. Inside of the Soviet Union, scores of war crimes were committed against people, and whole villages were razed to the ground. Often houses and settlements were burned with people still inside them. Citizens inside of towns and cities such as Leningrad were also subjected to heavy bombardment from the Luftwaffe and the skies. But as the Second World War began to turn against the Germans, following the Battle of Stalingrad, which was seen as a major turning point in World War II, the Soviets fought back, and they began to liberate parts of their own lands, which had fallen under occupation. Kharkov as a city had been occupied in late October 1941, and the Germans had rounded up thousands of civilians, including Soviet prisoners of war, and they had been executed by the Einsatzgruppen death squads. In fact, during one day, on the 15th of December 1941, 15,000 people from the city had been exterminated in a mass shooting in Drobetskaya. There were also gas fans and hangings used against civilians, and there were often bodies strung up from lampposts in the city, as the Germans struck terror into the hearts of the civilians. The Gestapo inside of Kharkov also shot 435 patients who were being treated inside of a local hospital. They did not discriminate by age, and in this particular war crime, they shot old men, women, and also children who were seeking medical help. But then as the war continued, the occupation of the city became much tougher, and in March 1943, there were 800 Red Army soldiers in the city who were being treated for their wounds, and these were then shot or burned alive by the German authorities. It was claimed about the actions in this region that the German fascist invaders had shot, hanged, burned alive, and poisoned by carbon monoxide gas more than 30,000 peaceful, completely innocent civilians, including women, old people, and children. Hitler and his military generals had given the men a free rein to do whatever they pleased inside of many Soviet cities, but there would be fierce fighting in 1943 around Kharkov, as the Soviet Red Army tried to push the Germans out. It was retaken by the Soviets in February 1943, before a counter-offensive was launched by the Wehrmacht, and they then recaptured Kharkov in April. But the city would then be liberated once and for all by the Soviets in August 1943. Kharkov had been completely devastated, and the Soviets had discovered scores of mass graves in the city. But to bring some form of retribution and a sense of justice to those civilians living there was a war crimes trial arranged against 4 men who were said to have been responsible for much of the terror. One of these 4 was a Soviet collaborator who had worked with the Nazis, and the other 3 were Germans. These men were just 4 of those who were put to the sword by the Soviets in reprisal, and they were all charged in participating in the extermination and murder of Soviet civilians, with the collaborator, Mikhail Bulanov, being charged also with treason. It was a military court, and there was a significant amount of testimony gathered against the men. Shockingly, the 4 of them all pleaded guilty, and it's not known if this plea was obtained through torture or duress, but they all admitted to the crimes, and they would describe what happened in detail. The men were accused of using gas vans, exterminating people, and murdering them also through gunshot and other means. Wilhelm Langheld was one of the defendants, and he admitted to slaughtering 100 Soviet civilians, and it was found that he ordered the shootings and took part in them. Hans Ritz also was involved in directing the shootings, which were carried out by an SD death squad based at Taganrog, and it was claimed that he battered the victims with weapons before their executions, and he tried to get information from them, torturing them. Reinhard Retzlaff was also a torturer, and he had allegedly ripped out the hairs of his victims and had then stabbed them with needles to get information, presumably about the Soviet Red Army's movements or the partisan resistance group's activities in the area. It was claimed that he also drove the victims into the gas vans and was involved in the burning of the bodies of these people. Mikhail Bulanov was the Soviet man accused of collaboration and treason, and he was also found to have betrayed the Soviet Union and sided with the enemy. He was a chauffeur who worked for the local Gestapo officer, and he allegedly took part in the use of gas vans, and he also took part in the shooting of 60 children. The Soviet military court wanted to put these 4 men to death for their crimes. The court proceedings are, it's considered, rather sketchy, and it is most likely that these men were of course war criminals, but their executions would be carried out as a powerful piece of vengeance propaganda for the Soviet people and Stalin, who had been suffering for some time. The prosecution stated, Teutonic Knights of the Great Eastern Expanse, who daily and hourly carried out Hitler's orders without feeling good feelings and pity, destroyed civilians and were proud of their cruelty, considering them subhumanly worthy only of mass destruction. It was also said that the men had carried out the everyday killings and executions. The evidence that emerged and the information about the war crimes brought a significant amount of terror to the courtroom, and they were all condemned to death for their crimes. In particular, the fate of Bulanov left a bad taste in the mouth of many Soviet people, as he had betrayed the motherland and sided with the Nazi enemy, becoming a cog in their deadly mass murder machine. The Soviets would not take long to carry out the executions of the 4 men, and the day after their death sentence had been handed out, the executions were performed. Inside of the city of Kharkov, there were 4 gallows structures that were quickly created for the executions overnight. Each of these had a large central beam in the sky, probably 4 meters high, and they then had a crossbeam attached, and another piece of wood, creating a triangle to make them more sturdy. There was no execution scaffold or platform made, and on the 19th of December 1943, the 4 men were taken out into the city of Kharkov for their executions on these gallows. Thousands of people had been gathered in the square around the execution structures to witness the deaths. There were 4 executioners who passed a rope over the gallows structure, and the men were driven up to the gallows on the back of a truck, with these acting as the platform for the condemned to stand on whilst the noose was secured. With the nooses attached around the necks of the condemned, the trucks then drove off, leaving the 4 men swinging on the gallows suspended high in the air, slowly strangling to death. One eyewitness who saw the proceedings that day claimed, "It was all over in a few moments." The defendants were hoisted onto the back of 4 open trucks and stood on stools. Then the nooses were looped around their necks. There was no blindfolding. During the preliminaries, 3 of the 4 prisoners had to be propped up. Bulanov had fainted, Ritz and Retzlaff had turned pasty white. They drawled at their mouths and their knees gave way. Only Langheld, the old soldier, remained stiff as a ramrod throughout, never once flinching. Once the nooses had been adjusted, at a signal the trucks pulled away, and the four were left dangling and kicking in midair. The execution of the four men that day inside of the city of Kharkov was some reprisal for the suffering that the people had been placed under with the German occupation. Let's remember that these executions were carried out in 1943, 2 years before the war would come to an end, meaning that the Soviets were bringing military charges and tribunal against captured POWs who were accused of shocking crimes even whilst the war was still going on. These executions that were carried out inside of Soviet cities and towns had a profound effect on the people, and it also helped to boost the power of Stalin, and his reputation was enhanced as the executions were seen as him wielding his iron fist upon the brutality of the German enemy. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.